The footage you're watching right now reveals how one of the world's largest armies is slowly collapsing from within. 1.2 million soldiers. More than 10,000 tanks. Hundreds of aircraft. All of them lost in a war that was officially claimed not to exist. And these numbers were compiled from Russia's own internal records, from the cemetery data of independent researchers, from satellite imagery. So who is the real winner of this war? The answer to that question is going to surprise you. March 19, 2026. The early hours of the morning. Vladimir Putin stepped in front of television cameras and announced something the world never expected. He was launching a special military operation in Ukraine. The words were carefully chosen. He didn't say war. He didn't say invasion. He said special operation. Because he wanted that word to evoke a timeline far shorter than anything a war implies. The Kremlin's calculation that day was simple: the Ukrainian army collapses within days. The Kiev government flees or surrenders. The West objects but falls silent within weeks. And Russia walks away with new territory. The plan looked perfect, politically, militarily, and psychologically. On paper. In those first days, some things did unfold according to the Russian plan. From the north through Belarus toward Kiev, from the southeast along the Donbass front, and from the south through Crimea, Russia entered Ukrainian territory on 3 separate fronts simultaneously. Russian convoys advanced to within 40 kilometers of Kiev. The world watched. It held its breath. And then something unexpected happened. Ukrainian resistance. Zelensky didn't run. When Western leaders offered the Ukrainian president an evacuation flight, his response entered the history books: "I need ammunition, not a ride." This wasn't symbolism. It was a genuine will to resist, and that will turned out to be the single greatest miscalculation in Russia's plan. By March 2022, Russia was forced to withdraw from the Kiev front. The northern offensive had failed to hold. The focus shifted south and east. Kherson, Mariupol, Donbass. The war changed shape. But the real bill hadn't yet come due. It would take time to arrive. And today, that bill speaks in numbers. The most contested subject of this war is casualties. And there's a reason it's contested. Russia has not released any frontline loss figures since September 2022. Think about that. For more than 3 years, Russia's Ministry of Defense has not told its own country how many soldiers have died. The last official statement, back in September 2022, put the number at fewer than 6,000. So what actually happened? The Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, SIS, released a report in January 2026 showing that from February 2022 to December 2025, Russia suffered approximately 1.2 million military casualties. That figure includes wounded, missing, and killed. The estimated death toll alone stands at around 325,000. SIS's assessment was staggering. No major power has suffered losses like this since the Second World War. The independent Russian media outlet Mediazona, in a joint investigation with BBC News Russian, placed the confirmed Russian death toll at 200,000. But it emphasizes that this figure falls well short of the real number, because in Russia, even obtaining a death certificate has become a political process. Families face state pressure and receive these documents late, or not at all. An independent analysis from the Caucasus Strategic Research Center produced chilling data on the daily death rate. In 2024, Russia was losing an average of 240 soldiers per day. By 2025, that figure climbed to 390 per day. The number of published death notices rose 60% compared to the previous year. What do these numbers mean? Russia is losing more people with every passing month. And the pace isn't slowing. Looking beyond personnel losses, the picture becomes even more devastating. According to data published by Ukraine's Armed Forces General Staff, Russia has lost 10,676 tanks, 22,266 armored vehicles, 26,600 artillery systems, 370 aircraft, and 335 helicopters since the start of the war. Measured against the total military hardware any single country typically holds, these figures are extraordinary. Russia burned through decades of accumulated equipment in a matter of years. So what did it gain in return? One of the most striking findings in the size report is this: during Russia's most significant offensive operations, the Frontline advanced at an average rate of 15 to 70 meters per day. Size described this as a pace of advance, no faster than virtually any major offensive campaign of the past century. In other words, Russia was losing hundreds of soldiers every single day and gaining, on its best days, an area smaller than a football field. As of March 2026, roughly 19 to 20% of Ukrainian territory remains under Russian control. According to the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, Russian forces captured a total of 572 square kilometers of additional territory from the beginning of 2026. That number might sound large. But consider what was paid for those 572 square kilometers, the tens of thousands of soldiers who died during that period, the hundreds of vehicles destroyed, the thousands of tons of ammunition consumed. And the picture looks entirely different. Putin has told both domestic audiences and world leaders, including Trump, that Russia is advancing successfully. There's a measure of truth to that. It is advancing on the front. But the cost of that advance has far exceeded the value of what's been gained. This raises a critical question: how long can Russia sustain this tempo? According to a report from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, ISS, Russia is recruiting approximately 30,000 to 35,000 new soldiers per month. But that number is increasingly struggling to offset frontline losses. Russia expert Nigel Gould-Davies noted that the capacity for expansion is limited. At some point, the system will seize up. The problem isn't just troop numbers; trained officers and quality equipment are also running thin. On the economic front, the picture is equally strained. Russia's defense spending has roughly doubled in real terms since 2021. Total war costs have surpassed $186 billion. Under sanctions, Russia's oil and gas revenues have declined. More than 1,000 foreign companies have suspended or scaled back their Russian operations. And in the first year of the war, approximately 1.3 million people left Russia, the majority of them educated, skilled professionals. The least discussed but perhaps most decisive dimension of this war is technology. Specifically, unmanned aerial vehicles, drone warfare. And the story Ukraine has written in this domain is genuinely extraordinary. At the outset of the war, Ukraine held a certain advantage in drone technology. FPV drones converted from commercial components, and the Turkish-supplied Bayraktar TB2S, turned Russia's armored columns into a nightmare in the early phase. Russia adapted. But so did Ukraine, without pause. In June 2025, Ukraine executed one of the most audacious drone operations the world has ever seen. Codenamed Operation Spider Web, the strike was planned over 18 months by Ukraine's security service, the SBU. Using 117 drones launched from trucks covertly positioned inside Russian territory, Ukraine struck 5 strategic air bases simultaneously. Among the targets was the Belia Air Base in eastern Siberia, 4,300 kilometers from Ukraine. More than 40 Russian aircraft were damaged. Defense analysts called this operation one of the most remarkable planning achievements in the history of modern warfare. One defense industry expert summarized it this way: Russia just experienced its own Pearl Harbor. Because Russia didn't just lose aircraft, it lost confidence in its internal security. The bases that were struck were deep inside Russian territory. For Russia, this was a catastrophic intelligence failure. How did Russia respond? It ramped up drone production to 30,000 units per year, with some estimates projecting that figure to double by 2026. In a single night, it launched over 400 drones and missiles at Ukraine. In February 2026, Ukraine's air defense intercepted 392 aerial targets, described as achieving the impossible. But no shield is 100%. Some attacks get through. And every attack that gets through means new suffering. In March 2026, Russia launched 137 drones. Ukraine shot down 122. The destruction wrought by the remaining 15 filled news bulletins for hours. Ukraine is reborn every night. Ukraine bleeds every night. But it doesn't break. Ukraine's counterstrikes aren't slowing down either. Kyiv has intensified long-range attacks into Russian territory, targeting Russia's south, Black Sea coastal cities, the Stavropol region, Rostov, and areas stretching into the North Caucasus. Ukrainian drones have reached a major oil refinery near St. Petersburg, a target 1,300 kilometers inside Russia's border. The direct battlefield impact of these strikes remains debated. But the psychological effect is unmistakable. Russians can no longer say, "The war is far away, it doesn't concern us." The outskirts of Moscow are being bombed. Air bases in Siberia are burning. The war has moved inside the country. August 2024. While the world tracked Frontline news in a half-asleep routine, the Ukrainian military made a move that genuinely wrote history. It launched a ground offensive into Russia's Kursk region. This wasn't merely strategic, it was psychologically seismic. Because the dominant narrative from the start of this war had been, Ukraine defends, Russia attacks. Ukraine flipped that narrative. It entered Russian soil. Russian civilians were forced to flee border towns. A state of emergency was declared in the Kursk region. According to social media data, Ukrainian units advanced up to 15 kilometers inside Russian borders. Intense fighting erupted along a 10-kilometer front including settlements such as Sudza and Koronivo. Russia scrambled to respond while equipment worth hundreds of millions of rubles was left behind. Approximately 3,000 civilians were reported evacuated to other regions. The Kremlin tried to downplay the development. It couldn't. Because the world saw not the NATO-dependent, Russia-fearing, defense-crouching Ukraine it had come to expect, but a Ukraine entering the territory of the world's largest nuclear power. That image was extraordinarily powerful. Ukraine's move wasn't purely military. It was a negotiating table calculation. Kyiv wanted to arrive at any future peace table with the message, "We hold territory too." And this calculation wasn't hollow. Because when peace talks do come up, those Kursk holdings could serve as a bargaining chip. The North Korean dimension added an entirely separate layer. The Ukrainian military reported that more than 11,000 North Korean soldiers had been deployed to the Kursk and Sumy sectors. This widened the international scope of the conflict and sharpened Western reactions considerably. Pyongyang's entry alongside Moscow made unmistakably clear that this is no longer a war between two countries alone. What determines the course of this war is not battlefield power alone. Economic support, weapons deliveries, and international political will are at least as decisive as anything happening on the front. Ukraine has received enormous support from Western nations. The European Commission presented Ukraine with a €90 billion credit package in January 2026, €30 billion earmarked for budget support, €60 billion for defense needs. French President Macron announced that France now covers two-thirds of the intelligence previously supplied by the United States to Ukraine. But this support has never flowed smoothly. Under the Trump administration, Washington's backing contracted significantly. U.S. military aid was nearly cut off entirely. Europe scrambled to fill the gap. Zelensky pivoted to what he called the European Shield Doctrine, because without the US, Europe was Ukraine's only guarantor. Europe experienced this shift in a deeply painful way. French Senator Olivier Cadic captured the continent's mood in a single sentence: "If we don't send our cannons today, we'll have to send our children tomorrow." This wasn't political rhetoric. It was a genuine conviction that this war threatens Europe's very existence. By the 48th month of the war, EU leaders, believing that a Russian victory wouldn't stop at Ukraine but would target other Eastern European states, increased defense spending across the board. Germany and France now frame this conflict not as a regional crisis at the doorstep, but as a lethal threat to all of Europe. The Geneva peace talks, meanwhile, have hit a genuine deadlock. In the third round of talks in mid-February 2026, the US's apparent openness to Russia's territorial demands put EU nations on high alert. Ukraine stated it wanted a ceasefire along the current line of contact, with negotiations beginning from that point. Russia maintained its narrative of successful advance. A ceasefire between these two parties seems unachievable for now, because expectations don't overlap. Ukraine wants territorial integrity. Russia wants to keep what it's taken. In this equation, everyone winning at the same time is mathematically impossible. The Kremlin's war narrative was meticulously crafted. Special military operation. These words functioned as a political shield within Russia. The word war cannot be used. Losses cannot be shared. Anti-war demonstrations are prosecuted. But numbers can't be hidden. Coffins arriving in small Russian towns can't be hidden. The 1.3 million people who fled the country after mobilization was declared can't be hidden. No one should claim Russia is about to collapse in the short term. But the cost of carrying this burden is growing with every passing month. On the economic front, the signals are becoming concrete. IISS defense finance expert Fenella McJurdy acknowledged signs of slowdown in the Russian economy. War spending has begun consuming a vast share of GDP. Inflation is climbing. Interest rates are at historic highs. Russia's central bank cannot lower rates, because the economy has genuinely converted to a war footing. The view from outside is even more striking. Former NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg put it this way: Russia is also becoming far more dependent on China. Moscow is mortgaging its future to Beijing with every passing year. This is diplomatic language, but it points to a real danger. To circumvent Western sanctions, Russia became reliant on Chinese markets, Chinese technology, and Chinese financing. But that dependency carries a price. And over the long term, it erodes Russia's strategic autonomy. The deployment of North Korean soldiers to fight on Russia's behalf is another expression of this dependency. What did Russia give Pyongyang in return? The full answer remains unknown, but analysts point to technology transfers, economic agreements, and diplomatic reciprocity. If a country needs the soldiers of another dictatorship to seize its neighbor's land, is that a position of strategic strength? In small rural towns on the Russian front, an entirely different Russia exists. Elderly residents file out of funeral services. Young women lie awake at night, no longer expecting husbands who won't come home. Veterans discharged from the front return to unemployment, no support, and untreated psychological wounds. This social erosion is invisible today. But it will surface in the years ahead. Ukraine's own picture must be laid out honestly. Because the people who stand on the right side of this war are also suffering enormously. According to the size report, Ukraine has sustained between 500,000 and 600,000 military casualties since February 2022. Death toll estimates reach as high as 140,000. Zelensky had previously stated far lower figures. But independent analyses point to a far heavier toll. Ukraine is a small country. Its population is below 40 million. And these losses are cutting deeply into the fabric of society. Energy infrastructure has taken catastrophic damage. Russia weaponized winter. It targeted Ukraine's major power plants, heating systems, and electricity distribution grids. During the winter of 2026, with temperatures in Kyiv plunging to -20 degrees Celsius, millions of people grappled with heating and electricity failures. The New York Times reported that Russia was attempting to isolate major cities and break the morale of the population. But this destruction has not broken society. That may be the most astonishing reality of this war. Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, has renewed martial law and general mobilization repeatedly in 3-month intervals. Kyiv Mayor Klitschko described the current moment as the most serious phase of 4 years of full-scale war. Yet people aren't fleeing their cities. City centers are alive. Cafes are open. The metro runs. Resistance, both military and civilian, continues. What is the source of this resilience? Something simple yet profound. Before 2022, there were periods when many Ukrainians didn't fully experience themselves as a distinct nation with a distinct identity. Many spoke Russian. A shared history was often invoked. But when Russian tanks entered Kyiv, that narrative shattered. Today, the vast majority of Ukrainians say they will not surrender their sovereignty no matter what happens. This transformation of identity may be one of the most enduring outcomes of this war. Wars have winners and losers. But sometimes, even as a war draws toward its end, those two categories are hard to define. Russia has captured certain territories along the front. That's real. But what it paid to take those territories, militarily, economically, in human terms, has been enormous. Washington-based analysts frame it this way: Russia is declining as a great power. It has lost a significant portion of its defense capability. Its dependence on China has deepened. It has pushed its relationship with the West back by decades. Whether capturing a few hundred square kilometers of territory at this price constitutes a genuine victory is a legitimate question to ask. Ukraine, meanwhile, managed to remain standing without losing everything. A country expected to fall in the first days of the invasion is still fighting 4 years later. It holds roughly 80% of its territory. It is launching strikes deep inside Russia. And it continues its process of integration with Europe. Its losses are heavy. Its pain is immense. But it has preserved its existence. And under international law, its cause remains legitimate. Size's assessment captures this balance with striking clarity. The data shows that Russia has paid an extraordinary price for very limited gains and is declining as a great power. As of spring 2026, total casualties on both sides are expected to approach 2 million. 2 million people. Men, women, fathers, children. Behind that number are individual lives. Families with no time left to grieve. Thousands of children who will grow up without fathers. This is the real face of war. Not the arrows on maps, not the kilometer calculations. The real face is this. Peace talks are suspended. A ceasefire date is uncertain. Diplomatic channels are open but fruitless. Russia claims to hold the initiative on the battlefield while Ukraine insists any ceasefire must begin from the current line of contact. The deep chasm between these two positions isn't closing. The prevailing view among war analysts is this. This conflict has transformed from a classic victory or defeat equation into a prolonged war of attrition in which both sides are grinding each other down. And in wars of attrition, the side that wins is usually the side that can endure longest. Russia has a larger economy, a larger population, a larger military capacity. That is real. But in terms of motivation, international support, and historical narrative, the balance sits somewhere very different. What we know, this war isn't over. What else we know, when it ends, the world's security architecture, Europe's defense structure, and the question of how 2 million people's lives were shaped, or ended, will define the legacy of what happened here. In the end, one question always remains: was all this suffering, all these losses, all this destruction truly inevitable? It's too soon to answer. But it's never right to stop asking.